Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of episode 2 of season 3 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds called Wedding Bell Blues. And there's a lot of stuff I'm going to nitpick about this episode, but first of all I want to say I actually did enjoy it because it's the kind of light-hearted comedic episode that I always liked in the older Star Trek shows, and also visually it's very beautiful in the show. It's exactly what I always said Star Trek should be. They're showing us a beautiful future in which people are friendly and it's all very colorful, and it's a kind of place you want to be in. It's the kind of future you want to live in because everything is very nice and all the beautiful costumes and the many different types of aliens all living together. So it really kind of warms my heart. That's exactly what I always said Star Trek should be. I'm not saying it should be that way in every single episode because that would get boring, but at least show that's the normal day-to-day life in the Federation, an enlightened future which is optimistic and all of that you can just watch as an escapism. That's such a nice place, I wish I would live there. That's the kind of setting that Star Trek should have in their normal day-to-day life. That's kind of a future to aspire to, a future that you want to get to. So I did actually enjoy this a lot in that aspect. And now let's get to the nitpicking. So this episode takes place 3 months after the previous one, so the Enterprise is being repaired. They almost finished the repairs. Uhura now shows her real hair, not hidden behind a weird bald cap with a strange wig to try to appear like in the previous season, so finally she looks normal. And as for the character of Spock, as usual, they make him out to be exactly the opposite of what he's supposed to be, so he's constantly over-emotional and violent and heartbroken, and we did have glimpses of that kind of behavior in TOS, but it was very rare. The usual day-to-day Spock was almost robotic, and yet in all of New Trek, whenever they show Spock, he's constantly over-emotional and violent with outbursts and heartbroken, and so he's the opposite of what Spock should be. Now the usual excuse is that this is a prequel, so he has not yet learned to control himself, so he's not yet the Spock you know from TOS, but I keep asking, so when exactly are we going to get that Spock that we know from TOS? Maybe in the very last episode of the show, he will suddenly say, you know what, from tomorrow on, I will now start behaving like a Vulcan. And we'll stop with this emotional nonsense. Like, they will leave it to the very last episode. So the excuse of it being a prequel is getting more and more ridiculous the closer we're supposed to be getting to the time of TOS. And also they constantly show him shirtless in the show to show off his muscular body, which I have no problem with, but it's kind of weird. Like I guess it's another sign of the gender reversal that they're constantly doing. In the older shows they would usually use the female characters as the sex appeal of the show, show off some skin, show off some cleavage. And in all the New Trek shows they are now using the men and showing off their bodies. And the same kind of thing they constantly do with Pike, because Pike has a girlfriend who is a strong female character, who is a captain of her own ship, and in this episode she talks about taking him in to live in her quarters on her new ship, and they even make a joke about how many hair products he has. That actually was kind of funny because his hair is very well maintained, I guess, and so she jokes about, where will I put all your hair products in your room on my ship when you live as my mate on my ship? And how they put him in the kitchen and he's the one cooking for everyone across the whole ship. So it constantly feels like they're doing a deliberate gender swap. The same kind of thing which was problematic for women in the past, now they're doing it to the men to punish them. So they do kind of do it in a humoristic way, so I don't really mind it so much, because they kind of show that Pike enjoys cooking. He's doing it as a hobby. It's not like he's being forced to. So it's okay, I guess, but still they do it kind of in every single episode. So they did kind of a weird swap of the gender roles. So Pike is in the kitchen, and Spock is constantly apologizing to every woman he meets, and he's not in control of his emotions. When you start noticing this pattern, it becomes kind of annoying. Shouldn't there simply be equality between both genders? Shouldn't everyone simply do whatever they want? Anyone can cook in the kitchen if they want to, not just the men. Everybody's bodies should be shown, not just the men. And speaking of strong female characters, we see that Ortega made a full recovery after she almost died in the previous episode. She was stabbed by a Gorn and was in critical condition, and her hand was digested, she was missing some of her fingers, and now we see she's totally fine. And they never explained how they fixed that. Does she have an artificial hand now? Did they simply regrow her fingers? In the previous Star Trek shows which are set centuries in the future, they were not exactly able to do that. Remember when Nog lost his leg they didn't just grow him a new leg, but they gave him an artificial one. So how come she has a brand new hand without explanation? I think it would just simply be cool to show that she has an artificial hand, just like, Luke Skywalker. And she would be complaining about that, and then Dr. Corby would say something like, "What's so bad about a robotic hand? Maybe it's even better." Since we know that he will later become an android and will be happy about it, so that would be a kind of a nice reference, but as always they missed the opportunity to do something clever. So anyway, I think it was a missed opportunity not to show that she has some kind of artificial robot hand, which can look like a real one from the outside, but still it would be so cool simply to see a glimpse of that, and yet they didn't do that. And the whole thing that she's back to normal annoyed me because what was the point of that fake almost death scene in the previous episode if it doesn't actually lead to anything? I guess in the very end of this episode they do show that she has PTSD from that. As always with the show, it's all about the feelings in the PTSD and not anything physical. And the same with Spock, it's now all about his feelings and emotions, and he misses Nurse Chapel so much because he's in love with her and she went off to study somewhere, which I guess fixes that little continuity mistake in TOS that I kept complaining about previously, that they said that she was studying something with Dr. Roger Corby, who became her lover, and only later she came to the Enterprise. So now they did that in this 3-month period that they time jumped. That was the time that she hooked up with Roger Corby. That's the guy who later they found on some planet in TOS, and he was a robot because his body died, and he transferred his consciousness to some robot body because he found some ancient robots on that planet. And so they kind of tried to fix this continuity issue, but they now create even more problems because Spock in that episode of TOS never met Roger Corby. When they talk with Corby on the radio, Spock asks Chapel if she recognizes his voice, indicating that he does not recognize it. And so he meets him in this episode, but then doesn't recognize his voice later. Maybe we can say that was an implication that maybe he detects that something is off about him, that he doesn't sound exactly the same, maybe because he's a robot. So we can come up with excuses to explain the continuity problem, but it's still a continuity problem because in that original scene it was obvious that Spock did not know him personally. So I guess we can come up with excuses. Maybe we can say maybe it's because he lost his accent, because he has a strange accent in this new episode, and yet in the original series he didn't have any accent. So maybe that's what he was talking about, that it's hard to recognize him. And then she tells him she does recognize him and asks Spock, "Have you ever been engaged?" Which was another kind of continuity problem, because how come they all forgot about Spock's fiancée who was on the show and met all these people, and yet they forgot all about her? And maybe we can say she was answering him sarcastically. Maybe she knew the answer already and was kind of simply poking fun at him. And also, that line is now even weirder and I guess supposed to be funny, that because of the events of this episode in which Spock almost marries Christine. And so maybe that line into S, "Have you ever been engaged?" is supposed to kind of remind him of the events of this episode in which he personally met Corby. So that's why she said it. So he doesn't recognize his voice over the subspace radio, and then asks her, "Are you sure it's him?" And then she tells him, "Have you ever been engaged?" So maybe it's kind of a joking way to remind him of the events of this episode, to remind him that he actually met him before because he forgot. So anyway, the continuity is a bit of a mess. And as I said many times, the only way to really explain it all is saying that this whole show is set in a slightly different timeline. So there are similar events, but they're not exactly the same. And Spock himself at some point in this episode wonders maybe we're all in a slightly different dimension or something, to try to explain why things suddenly changed. And the reason they actually suddenly changed was because apparently Trelane, who was a character from the original series who was very similar to Q, has been spying on them and for some reason decided to change reality to make Spock marry Christine instead of Roger. And we don't actually get any real explanation for why exactly he wanted to do it. I mean, in the very end he said it's simply because he was annoyed by Dr. Corby, who was too handsome and perfect, and that annoyed him for some reason, and so he decided to grant Spock his wish of being with Christine instead of him. And he's basically playing with everybody like dolls, I guess, to try to make a wedding. So it's not really clear why would he even want to do any of this. And it was always a debate between Trek fans of is Trelane actually a Q or not, because obviously it's kind of the same kind of idea, but also there are very big differences. And so there's a whole bunch of continuity mess. Also in Voyager, they mentioned how Q were not reproducing with each other sexually. And I have some quotes from Voyager directly saying that. Maybe you can say Q lied about that. He didn't actually say the truth. But again, it's a continuity mess. And technically, they never actually said the name Trelane in this whole episode, so we can assume it's not actually the same entity. Maybe it's something similar, but not exactly the same one, even though he behaves exactly the same way and he dresses exactly the same way. And also, it doesn't really make sense if you think about it, because the characters in the episode actually see him differently than what we do. We see him looking similar to how Trelane was in TOS, but all the characters see him as something else. And we see glimpses of that in the mirrors. When he looks at a mirror, we see that he's either a Vulcan or an Andorian. He doesn't look like what we see him as. And I guess it's a way to avoid even more continuity problems, because how come no one mentioned recognizing him in TOS if they've encountered him before? But the explanation here is that they simply don't see him as the way we see him. They see him as different aliens and different characters, and never heard his name, and so that's why they didn't recognize him. But how come we can see him as the way he looked like in TOS when his real form is an energy cloud, as we see in the end of this episode? So his real form is not even corporeal, so how come we see him looking similar to how he was in TOS? So it doesn't really make any sense if we think about it. And there are other contradictions, like when he made that fake environment in TOS, the food, they said, had no taste, like it was all fake. And yet here we see him snapping his fingers and creating all kinds of cakes for them, and they say they taste wonderful and all of that. So that seems like a contradiction, because later on in TOS he was unable to produce food with real taste, and yet here he is able to. So that doesn't really make sense. I guess I can come up with the idea that, you know, the Q can time travel easily. They are not living linearly, so maybe from his perspective he's actually met them before and he went back in time to mess with them in the past without revealing himself, so that it wouldn't affect the future. So I guess I can come up with ideas like that, but it makes it all way too convoluted for no real reason. So there was a specific scene in TOS in which he went on the Enterprise and met Spock for the very first time, and he never mentioned anything about ever encountering him in the past. He was surprised to see Spock and to see that he's a Vulcan and all of that. So how does that make any sense if he already met him in this show, which is set before, unless he time traveled? Also, the fact that, you know, the whole idea of that episode was that he was living on some distant planet and looking at Earth with some kind of very long distance telescope, and that's why he was reenacting stuff from Earth's past. Because of the speed of light, he didn't yet know what they're like now presently. That's why he was so surprised when he visited the Enterprise bridge, that they no longer displayed their weapons on the walls and stuff like that. So he was seeing humanity as it was in the past. That's what he was trying to reenact on that planet. And yet here he meets them in the present, so how come he didn't know that they changed when he met them again in TOS? So that's what I mean with the continuity mess. I can come up with excuses, saying maybe he simply pretended not to recognize Spock, maybe he simply pretended not to know that humans change and are no longer like they were in the past, as he saw through his telescope with the limitations of the speed of light. And also, you know, Trelane in TOS was very powerful, but he was not all powerful like the Q in TNG and onward. And so tying it all together, I'm not even sure is such a good idea. You know, this was a long debate between Trek fans. Was Trelane actually a Q or not? Obviously, he was the same kind of idea. He was the same kind of character who likes to mess around with supposedly lesser beings for his own entertainment. And there was that scene in which he was a judge in a trial, and it was all basically kind of a game for him. So it was a similar kind of idea, but he was shown to be not as powerful. So maybe because he was not yet fully matured Q, maybe he didn't yet have all of their powers, he had lesser powers. But then it's a continuity problem with Voyager, because in Voyager we saw Q having a child with another Q, which he implied was the first time ever. He said that Q were not reproducing in such a way. He implied that the Q always existed and did not make children up until that point. And when he produced a child on Voyager, in just 1 or 2 years he was fully matured and with full control of all the Q powers, and so it doesn't make sense that Trelane does not yet have his full powers when they say in this episode he's 8,000 years old, which I guess is very young for Q, but he's still behaving like a little kid, which doesn't really make much sense if we actually think about it logically. So in thousands of years he's still behaving like a little child and doesn't have full control of his powers. And I guess one excuse is maybe he's not fully Q, maybe, you know, as Q said in Voyager, and I quote, he said, "It's ridiculous for a Q to mate with another Q." He specifically said, "The Q are way beyond sex, it's never been done." So how come in the ending of that episode of TOS, Trelane's parents shows up? It's obviously a couple of energy entities who are his parents, and in the ending of this new episode, we see the same kind of energy cloud appearing, and it has the voice of John Delancey. So that heavily implies that's the same Q we know from TNG, and he is the dad of Trelane. And so where is the mom? Because in the ending of the TOS episode, we saw that he has two parents, a mom and a dad. And yet in Voyager, he said that the Q are not creating children. So I guess maybe the mom was some other entity, which is not the Q, maybe some other energy entity, which is very powerful, which he had sex with to produce Trelane. So maybe Trelane is simply part Q and part something else. But wasn't there an episode of TNG when Q was studying Amanda, who was part Q because her parents used to be Q and then became human and produced her, and then she showed up signs of being a Q, and he said that it's not allowed by the Q continuum for her to exist because she's some kind of inbreed, she's part human, part Q, and that's not allowed. And I guess later on in Voyager, the Q continuum changed its mind, and now it was okay to be half Q and half human or whatever. So it's all a jumbled mess. And so I'm not sure it was even a good idea to tie the Q with Trelane. Maybe they should have simply shown Trelane, and we can assume it's a different type of powerful alien which is similar to the Q, but not one of the Q. And it would actually make more sense, because why should there be only one powerful energy entity in the universe? We did see there were a bunch of other non-corporeal entities which are very powerful all throughout the galaxy, so why should there only be one such species? So tying things together too much might actually be a bad idea, because it makes everything look smaller, and it has to be exactly the same Q that we know from TNG, because now we have the voice of John Delancey as the dad of Trelane, and so they're all related, so it makes the galaxy seem smaller, I think. Even though it was nice to hear John Delancey, and it is kind of neat to try to tie it all together, on the other hand, it just creates even more continuity problems. And I guess I can come up with convoluted excuses saying maybe it's all non-linear, maybe the Q we see and hear here actually time traveled from the future after he had Q Jr. in Voyager, and only later he went back to the past and produced Trelane. And technically we never hear the name Trelane in this entire episode, so we can assume it might be a different character altogether, and that's why he didn't remember meeting them before when he met them in TOS. But why does he dress exactly the same way? Why does he have exactly the same mannerisms? So obviously it's supposed to be the same character. So I guess he just pretended not to know them already when he met them again in TOS, and he specifically was behaving so surprised seeing Spock and saying how much he doesn't like him. But in this episode he seems to like him a lot, because he seems to grant him his wishes and trying to make him be with Christine instead of Roger. And also in this episode he was not really all powerful, because he tried to make everyone behave in the way he wanted. At first Corby was able to resist it somehow, maybe because he was so much in love with Christine. And then he was able to snap Spock out of it by angering him, and then Spock knew the truth. That is actually kind of similar to stuff that happened in TOS. There was one episode when something was affecting Spock's mind, and the way Kirk was able to snap him out of it was by making him angry and violent, and then Spock knew the truth suddenly. So I guess it's kind of similar to that. But again, it shows that Trelane is not really all powerful, and yet in other places they show him snapping his fingers to make anything he wants possible. So is he a Q or not? So I guess he's a half Q, because Q had sex with some other energy cloud which was not a Q, so that's why Trelane doesn't have full Q powers, I guess. He's limited, and yet he's able to turn people into dogs and make everyone else not notice that it's strange. That kind of reminded me of a scene in TNG when Q turned Beverly into a dog, and so obviously he is supposed to be a Q here, and then the real Q shows up and takes him away to be punished or something for playing with the humans again, even though that's something he himself will later do, even though he's an adult Q. So if we actually think about any of it, it doesn't really make sense. Why is he angry at his son for playing with humans when he later does the same thing himself? So maybe we can say it's a more mature Q who came from the future to the past, but we saw that Q said he was dying in season 2 of Picard when he again was messing around with humanity. Up until the time he supposedly died, he said he was dying from something in Picard, and so that was his last meeting with humanity. So he was doing that kind of thing up until he died, supposedly in Picard, and yet a century before all of it, he was against playing with humans, and so none of it makes any sense if we think about it. And after it's all over and these energy entities leave, Pike just goes back to normal. He never even informs anyone at Starfleet. Why doesn't he call for a red alert? Why doesn't he inform any of the other commanders in the starbase? You know, there are some dangerous entities roaming around the starbase and going into our starships and forcing people to do things they don't want to do and erasing our memories, changing our memories. It is kind of a serious situation, don't you think? So he doesn't even bother to inform anyone about these very powerful entities going around their starships. Why not raise the shields? Why not initiate scans? They don't yet know what the Q are at this time period. They haven't yet encountered beings like that. So why are they taking it all in such a calm way? I mean, if it happened in Voyager after they knew the Q already, they knew that when he says he's leaving, he is really leaving, so they wouldn't be as worried after multiple encounters with the Q. And yet this is supposed to be the first time they encounter something like that, and Pike just shrugs it off and goes back to normal, goes back to the party, doesn't even bother to inform anyone at Starfleet about this strange encounter with these powerful entities, and just doesn't do anything. So that is also kind of ridiculous. And when it's all in the context of a comedic, light-hearted episode, I guess I can forgive it, but still, if we think about it with any kind of logical mind, it becomes annoying because it doesn't make any sense. And all the continuity mess they now created, even though they tried to tie things up, but now they made it even worse because it makes no sense now with the dialogue in Voyager. So I guess either Q was a liar all throughout, he never said anything true. When he said he was single for billions of years, when he said that on Voyager, and yet here he says that his kid Trelane is only 8,000 years old, so how could he have been single? When he said he never mated with other entities to make more Q, now it's obviously not true, unless we can come up with the idea that Trelane is some kind of half-breed, part Q, part something else. And the whole motivation of Trelane didn't make any sense. What exactly was he trying to achieve? What was any of this actually about? That's the main problem with the storytelling in the show. That, you know, a lot of things are very pretty, very entertaining, but what was it all actually about? What was he actually trying to achieve? What was the actual motivation? Nothing is really clear. So it was all just for fun. He was just playing with dolls. I guess we can explain it that way, that's fine. So he was simply wanting to play with them like they were toys or pets or whatever, fine. But still it felt kind of lacking of any actual substance. So was it all just about seeing them in pretty dresses to dress them up for the wedding and that's it? That was the whole point? It was kind of funny when he started to go on a rant in the end, especially when he accused those blue aliens. How dare you be blue when my outfit is blue? Even though, weren't they all supposed to see him as an Andorian, so he was supposed to appear as blue to them anyway? So the only way to enjoy this episode is simply turn off our brain and not to think about it too much, because then it just gets annoying. And there was a lot of fun stuff. I enjoyed La'an teaching Spock how to dance. That kind of reminded me of an episode of TNG in which Data was preparing for the wedding of Keiko and O'Brien, and he wanted to learn to dance for the wedding. And then Dr. Crusher was teaching him, so that was kind of similar here, but not as funny as that episode of TNG. The whole reason it was funny was because Data was so bad at it, because he was too robotic and all of it, and that's why it was funny. And yet here, Spock becomes an expert at dancing, and that's it. So it's not really as funny as that idea was in TNG. So what the hell are they doing? So it's all really pretty looking, but not really as funny as it could have been and should have been. And there was a nice appearance by that alien, I think it's called Dogen, the one with the 3 hands. There was an alien like that in the old animated show, and we also saw those same kind of aliens in Lower Decks, and I think this is the first time we see a live action version of this alien, and it looks pretty neat, the way they made the 3 hands look organic, like it's not some guy in a costume, but they made some kind of special effect to do that. The only mistake I think is that those aliens are supposed to have only 3 fingers on each hand, and yet here the hands look human. But at least the special effect of the 3 hands looks kind of neat. And the episode ends with Ortega leaving the party to go boxing once again, and then she hears and sees hallucinations of the Gorn, and so I guess that's the only consequences we have of her almost getting killed by Gorn in the previous episode. So I guess it's better than nothing, but once again it's all about feelings and traumas and all that kind of stuff, and physically she's totally fine. without any explanation how she got her fingers back. And there was also a funny moment when Scotty said that he never drinks. He didn't want to drink alcohol in this episode, and eventually he did. So this is the episode that began his downward spiral into becoming an alcoholic. This is the first time he starts drinking heavily for this wedding. It was also nice to see how he was wearing that Scottish skirt in the wedding. And as I mentioned, all the costumes were great. You know, Uhura looked great. There was some Vulcan guy who was staring at her cleavage. And so visually this episode was really fun to look at. I really enjoyed it visually, but it could have been so much more interesting if it was actually about something and not just some silly idea by this alien to simply play around with them for no reason. And all the tie-ins with the Q and all of it is a continuity mess. But you know, we can say there are multiple different kind of entities like that, and maybe they're breeding with each other, so maybe that other cloud thing was not a Q but some different type of energy creature, and so maybe Trelane is simply half a Q. So that's, I think, is the best explanation that would fit in all of this continuity mess, especially with Voyager and all of it. So that's my thoughts. Let me know what you think and we can discuss it in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.